The void tore itself apart in silence as if the universe had screamed so loud it ran out of sound. Charred debris of what was once the equinox drifted across the upper thermosphere of an unnamed moon, its twisted hull torn wide like an autopsied beast. Plasma scars painted the bruised sky, the last remnants of the ambush that had turned scientific hope into orbiting wreckage. From the storm of broken metal and shattered purpose, a single escape pod fell like a burning seed, trailing smoke, faithless guidance, and a human life barely clinging to itself. The pod struck the dust-choked ground with a violence that twisted time and bone alike. Inside it, Jalen Murr lay unconscious, blood matting the side of his head, his lungs working harder than they should for air thinner than they deserved. Instruments around him blinked dying lights. The impact had shattered his shoulder and sent hairline fractures spiderwebbing down his ribs. His console readouts flickered uselessly. No life signs from the equinox, no nearby friendlies, no command signal. Only a harsh red error repeated across every frequency, like the universe was taunting him. He came to with a gasp that turned into a cough, coughing that became agony. Every breath ground itself against pain. Still he moved. Still he crawled from the ruined capsule into the windless twilight of a lifeless moonscape. Dust swallowed his boots, a fine shimmer of mineral grit clinging to every surface. His gaze swept the distant ridges, then the dark vein of caves that wound between jagged obsidian columns. Somewhere in that quiet wasteland, shadows moved, quick, flickering, uncertain. He followed them. The slope beneath him was slick with loose shale. Yet he descended anyway, driven less by logic than by the dull compass of instinct. His body was broken, his rations minimal, his communication array inert. None of it mattered as much as the glint he'd seen between those rocks, something too symmetrical, too curved to be natural. And when he found it, he understood why every part of him had kept moving. There she was, slumped between a fractured boulder and a half-collapsed basalt shelf. The creature was unmistakably Velari. Her skin was deep azure, faded by blood loss and injury. Her armor, an asymmetric weave of fiber plate and ritual bone, had been torn apart in at least 3 places. Her horns, once proud and polished, now cracked and dulled. Bio-tattoos shimmered beneath grime and clotted wounds, pulsing dimly in erratic patterns. A Velari warrior, a myth dressed in pain, a beast if one trusted military briefings. She was unconscious but breathing. Her chest rose unevenly. Her limbs twitched with residual muscle memory, as if still fighting something even in dreams. Jalen stood over her, one hand near the emergency plasma blade at his side. He could end her now. That would have been the correct action. That would have been the protocol. His entire training whispered that into the back of his skull, cold and certain. This was the species that had decimated his crew, shattered their research vessel in neutral space, and reduced science to ash. They were enemies by every measure that mattered. But he didn't move. He stared, not at the weapon near her side or the blood still wet across her thigh. Not at the fanged jaw or the bio-sigil branded across her shoulder. He looked at her fingers. They were clenched not into fists, but into desperation. Something about the way she was curled against the rock, some posture deep in her unconscious form, mirrored the same tension in his own body. He had never seen a Velari this close, and yet this wasn't fear he felt. It was something else. He lowered his weapon, dropped to one knee, tore open the medkit on his thigh, and began working. Her wounds were deep, but not beyond stabilization. The standard biogel hissed when it met Velari tissue, activating in a brief shimmer of heat. Her body jolted, her eyelids fluttered, her respiration quickened, but she did not wake. Jalen finished sealing the ruptured plasma ducts along her ribs, then adjusted her position so she wouldn't choke if shock hit hard. His hands moved with the muscle memory of someone who had patched dozens of human soldiers, but this body was different. Denser muscle fiber, higher core temperature. A scent like scorched quartz and silver sap filled his nostrils. Alien, wild, alive. The wind shifted. Distant movement echoed again along the ridgelines. Nothing showed in the dust, but he didn't trust the silence anymore. He lifted her. The moment her weight settled across his shoulders, he realized she was heavier than he expected, but not impossible. Her limbs dangled like those of a warrior who'd spent her last strength surviving something that should have killed her. Her breath was hot against his collar. He adjusted her grip, steadied himself, moved. Every step toward the distant caves dug a deeper trench of pain down his spine. His boots slipped in silt, his injuries screamed. But he walked. He didn't know why. Perhaps he did. Perhaps it was the way she'd looked. Not like a monster, not like the enemy, but like something fragile wrapped in the armor of something fierce, like a mirror turned sideways. By the time the first of the caves swallowed them in shadow, Jalen could no longer feel his arms. He found a hollow near the back wall, laid her there gently, and collapsed beside her. The cave was cool, pulsing faintly with veins of phosphorescent mineral. The air tasted old, still sharp with chemical salt. She didn't move. He watched her chest rise and fall, listened to the shallow breaths, listened to the ones echoing from his own lungs in response. Then, for the first time since the attack, Jalen let himself stop thinking about orders, about the war, about enemies. He looked at her one more time, let his eyes blur with the flickering light across her horns, and gave in to sleep. The cave did not judge. It merely waited for the story to begin. The wind outside howled with a hollow grief, threading through jagged canyons, like a memory that refused to die. Jalen woke to its moan reverberating through the stone, a sound like breath filtered through bone. His body protested the return to consciousness, sore in every place he remembered, and a few he didn't. The low bioluminescence of the cave had faded slightly, casting the space in a dim blue wash. Beside him, she still breathed. The Velari warrior. He had no name for her, remained unconscious. Her form coiled like a sprung trap, just out of tension. Her wounds had stopped bleeding, but bruises bloomed like oil across her skin, and heat radiated from her body, as though something internal struggled for balance. He touched her forehead briefly, his fingers recoiling at the fever blooming beneath her dermal layer. She wouldn't last long like this. He searched the emergency kit. One vial of pan-spectrum stabilizer remained, intended for human biology, risky, possibly fatal for non-terrestrials. His thumb hovered over the injector mine, spinning with uncertain probabilities. The logic was simple: leave her and live longer. Conserve resources, stay isolated, wait for a rescue that might never come. Instead, he adjusted her position, located the least invasive injection point, and delivered the dose. The reaction was immediate. Her limbs jerked violently as if trying to expel the foreign compound. She writhed against the stone muscles, taut breath accelerating into near panic. Jalen pinned her gently, one hand against her sternum, murmuring apologies she couldn't understand. After 30 seconds of chaos, her body stilled. The rise and fall of her chest steadied, and then her eyes opened. Crimson. They fixed on him with a focus so sharp it cut the silence. Her entire body tensed beneath his palm, and he realized too late how close he had leaned. Her breath ghosted against his jaw, hot and ragged. A low vibration coiled in her throat, not quite a growl, not quite a word. But she didn't strike. She simply stared. He withdrew slowly. The moment passed. Her gaze drifted and her head tilted slightly, taking in her surroundings. When her attention returned to him, something had shifted. Less feral, more questioning. No words passed between them. He stood, pulled the remains of his field pack closer, and unwrapped a heat-preserved ration block. The scent of synthetic protein filled the air, a sharp, plasticky aroma that made him grimace. He took a few bites, then broke off a piece and offered it to her. She eyed the food, then him, then the food again. She took it, chewed slowly, swallowed. Progress. When he tried to hand her a second piece, her fingers brushed his, not by accident. Her touch was strange, calloused, almost too warm, textured with ridges he hadn't noticed before. She held his gaze longer this time before retreating with the food. Something between them crackled. Not hostility, not yet trust. A third thing neither had the vocabulary to name. The day passed in shadow. Outside search vessels screamed overhead at intervals, sleek Velari patrol craft hunting survivors or strays. Their searchlights painted the terrain in long, methodical sweeps. The cave's mineral walls distorted heat signatures just enough to keep them safe. For now. By nightfall, her strength had returned enough for her to stand. She did it slowly with caution, but no hesitation, testing each joint with the patience of a veteran. Her height startled him. Taller by nearly a head, she carried herself with coiled strength, each movement precise. When she walked to the mouth of the cave, he followed, limping on a half-healed ankle. She stood for a while in silence, her gaze sweeping the sky like she was listening to something he couldn't hear. He broke the silence by preparing a second meal. The cave echoed with the sound of packaging and shifting metal. She returned, eventually watching his process with undisguised interest. This time, when he offered the ration, she didn't hesitate. They ate together under the watch of distant stars. Later, he tried to sleep again, but rest eluded him. She hadn't spoken, hadn't shown any inclination toward language, and yet he felt an overwhelming sense of communication nonetheless. A tilt of the head, a glance, the way she adjusted her posture when he winced from pain. She was watching him closely, learning him, and he, against better judgment, was learning her too. The next day, the cave was no longer safe. A low-frequency tremor passed through the stone just after dawn, a signal pulse used by Velari hunter squads to map terrain instability. They were getting close. Too close. He gathered his gear. She was already ready. Without a word, she approached him and extended a narrow length of reinforced cord woven from the remains of her tattered armor. She tied it gently around his injured arm, creating a sling that took pressure off the worst of the fractures. Then she slung her own salvaged blade across her back and stepped into the light. He followed. The moonscape stretched before them like a battlefield frozen in time. Jagged spires rose from cracked soil, ancient fault lines cutting across the horizon. They moved through it in silence, shadow to shadow, careful and deliberate. When he stumbled on loose stone, she caught him without breaking stride. When he gasped from the climb, she adjusted her pace, never once showing frustration. At midday, they found shelter inside a hollow spire long eroded by wind. The inner walls glowed faintly with mineral veins, enough light to see, not enough to give them away. As he rested against the stone, she sat opposite him, blade across her knees. He examined her from beneath half-lidded eyes. She wasn't what he expected. Not the savage beast described in tactical briefings. Not the mindless war machine painted in military propaganda. She was observant, efficient, fiercely intelligent. Every motion bore the discipline of training and the subtle weight of loss. At one point, she unfastened a torn segment of her armor and pressed it against her side. Beneath it, her wound had reopened, bleeding sluggishly. He gestured for her to stop, then approached, pulling out another stabilizer patch. She didn't flinch when he applied it. Her breath caught, but not from pain. They were close. Closer than either of them had intended. Their hands lingered too long. Her gaze locked onto his unblinking. Then she pulled away. The silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It vibrated between them, strung taut like the string of a bow waiting to be loosed. That night, they slept again near the rock wall, back to back, close enough to feel the heat from each other's spine. When morning came, she was already standing at the edge of the spire, eyes locked on the far ridge. He joined her. Beyond the rocks, partially buried under dust and vines, lay the unmistakable silhouette of Velari ruins. Tall, crystalline spires jutted from the landscape like the bones of gods. Their ancient glow pulsed with dormant power. He turned toward her. She met his eyes. No words passed. They began to walk. The ruins rose around them like the ribs of a forgotten colossus, each crystalline tower catching the pale light and refracting it through layers of ancient knowledge. Though windswept and overgrown, the structures of the Velari still thrummed with dormant intent. Jalen stepped cautiously across the moss-veiled floor of the first chamber, his breath catching at the haunting beauty. The architecture wasn't built, but grown its symmetry both alien and organic. Geometry had never felt so alive. Vera moved ahead without hesitation. Her body language shifted in these halls, less guarded, more reverent. She touched a crystalline panel with her palm, and beneath her skin, the faint blue shimmer of her bio-tattoos answered. The structure responded in kind, lighting up with slow pulses like breath returning to lungs long idle. They advanced through the chambers in silence. Old glyphs curled across the walls like static-born flame, shifting language that teased at translation. At the heart of the ruins, the temperature dropped. A long hallway led to a circular chamber pulsing with quiet resonance. In the center stood a pod, half coffin, half cocoon, suspended above the floor by 3 curved pylons etched with Velari sigils. Jalen hesitated. The pod was clearly alive in some way. A soft mist curled from its vents. Light danced beneath its transparent surface, like liquid memory. The console nearby displayed a diagnostic in what looked like a neural interface code, recognizable to him only because it mirrored ancient human brain mapping structures. It was a healing chamber, or something like one. Vera stepped forward. Her hand hovered over the activation pad, but her body betrayed her. The delayed wound in her side surged, and she dropped to one knee, breathing hard, a trail of blue blood staining the crystalline floor. Jalen rushed to her. He caught her before she collapsed entirely, her weight folding against his chest. Her skin burned with fever, her breath shallow. Her gaze was unfocused now, flickering between awareness and unconsciousness. He looked from her to the pod, then back. The decision wasn't really a decision. He keyed the interface. The chamber cracked open with a hiss. Biofilm peeled back like wet silk. The interior glowed faintly with Velari light, shifting between shades of white and silver blue. Symbols lit along the inside curve of the pod, forming a loop around an indentation designed for a body, possibly two. As he lifted her inside, the interface flared brighter. He barely had time to lay her within before a second slot opened beside hers, extending like a welcoming arm. Not meant for one. Not designed for isolation. Twin channels. Interlinked. Then came the spike. A flash of warning across the display, a signature scan activating. His biometrics were already being recorded. The pod was not just healing, it was syncing, a process that required dual resonance, shared frequency, neural overlap. It was searching for compatibility. He cursed aloud but stepped in anyway. The seal closed around them. Darkness followed. Not the unconsciousness of sleep or the oblivion of shock, but a deeper sensory black. Like standing in the space between stars, where thoughts moved slower and time breathed instead of marched. Then came the pressure. A thrum inside the skull. The sensation of another presence, not speaking, but feeling. It was her, not words, emotions. Memories like film reels twisted into taste and scent. Rage, pride, loss, her exile, her battle, a sky lit by fire. A brother's betrayal, and beneath it pain, the pain of isolation so long and profound it had become its own heartbeat. She felt him in return. The crash, the dead crew, the decision to help her when he had no reason. His confusion, his guilt, his awe. The moment he'd seen her not as Velari but as someone. His mind flinched at first, but the pod allowed no evasion, only exposure. There was no turning back. The biological interface slid deeper. Jalen felt his heart sink with hers for a brief moment, like two rhythms adjusting toward a compromise. Neural threads wrapped them both in code and light. Their minds overlapped. Not fusion, but intimacy. A comprehension that transcended translation. Then the chamber shifted. A warmth spread through his limbs, electric and magnetic. Not pain, not pleasure. A third thing, cellular alignment. Feedback loops forming. His skin tingled where hers brushed his, and through the shared haze he could feel her awareness leaning closer. Their eyes opened together, but the pod wasn't finished. Flashes of Velari script began flowing across the interior dome, recording vitals, cross-mapping tissue types. Biochemical markers flared and synchronized. A low chime sounded in the background, a confirmation tone. The system had accepted the resonance. The pod unlocked. Jalen gasped as fresh air rushed into his lungs, laced with the sterile tang of Velari antiseptic mist. The chamber opened, warm light spilling into the room. They sat up at the same time. The chamber floor hummed beneath them. Around them, the ruins pulsed brighter than before, as though the system had awakened with their sync. Vera's gaze snapped toward him. It was different now. Not just awareness, but knowledge. A kind of recognition no voice could achieve. She stood. So did he. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Whatever the pod had done, it had bound something between them. Whether temporary or not, he couldn't say. But her movements flowed like extensions of his own. He could feel her tension like it was embedded beneath his ribs. When she stepped toward the outer corridor, he followed without hesitation. Outside, the sky had darkened again. Distant engines rumbled. The hunters were near. She picked up her blade without looking, and he retrieved his scavenged rifle. As they moved toward the entrance, their coordination felt unnatural. She ducked low, he instinctively covered high. She veered right, he filled the left flank. It was as if they'd trained together, as if their instincts had begun to merge. They paused at the mouth of the ruins, staring down the long slope into the search grid. In the distance, Velari patrol ships crept low along the ridges. Aerial scouts fanned out across the basin, sweeping thermal scans across every ravine. She touched his shoulder. He didn't flinch. No words, no commands. They moved, side by side. The basin opened before them like a war god's altar, scarred with deep trenches and scorched formations that bore the memory of 100 forgotten battles. Beneath the cover of dusk, Jalen and Vera slipped from shadow to shadow, now more phantom than flesh. Each movement came without signal, without thought. She pressed against the flank of a stone column he angled to flank the ridge. When she crouched, he shifted his weight to silence his boots. There was no training manual for this kind of coordination. No doctrine accounted for bonded resonance. Below, a squad of Velari hunters, advanced armor gleaming with arc light under flickering search beams. These were not patrol drones, but Cyrex's elite, the sovereign hunters bred and raised in war temples, loyal only to conquest. Their visors swept the landscape in long arcs of pure detection, tuned to catch the ghost of an anomaly, the scent of deviation. Jalen could feel Vera tense before he saw the shimmer of their cloaking fields crackling against the rocks. She pointed, no indicated, without even raising her arm. He simply understood, and then they moved. The first scout stepped too far ahead. Vera was on him in an instant, her blade drawing a tight arc from neck to chest. He dropped without a sound, weapon clattering silently in the dust. Jalen intercepted the second, crouched near the ridge before he could trigger his alarm node. A jab to the soft neck seam, followed by a magnetic overload spike straight into the processor coil. The scout collapsed, convulsing silently. They took down 3 more before the perimeter sensors reacted. Then came the full strike. A warning pulse tore across the ravine, burning red against the dusk. Spotlights snapped to life. Plasma rifles flared. The ruins lit up again, not from ancient technology this time, but from war. Jalen and Vera fell back toward the outer edges of the basin, slipping into a narrow cut between stone ribs, where the terrain dipped like a natural trench. Explosions followed, sending sprays of molten dirt into the air. One beam caught the edge of Jalen's pack and vaporized half his medkit. The impact flung him back against the stone, knocking the wind from his lungs. Before he could regain his bearings, Vera was there, grabbing him, dragging him up with one arm while her blade intercepted another incoming bolt with a crackling shimmer. The weapon vibrated in her grip, absorbing and dispersing the impact through her armor's pulse-reactive mesh. He felt the burn of her muscles under his arm, the rhythmic pulse of her biocircuits syncing with his in a stuttering beat. They moved again. He fired blindly over his shoulder, catching one of the hunters in the thigh. Vera used the opening to leap into close quarters, her strikes as fluid as memory. The twin tips of her horns caught the moonlight as she spun, ducked, and plunged her blade between 2 armor plates with mechanical elegance. Jalen hacked a communications node as they passed. Its encryption melted in moments, thanks to the residual data flowing from their shared resonance. The pod hadn't just linked thoughts. It had opened channels. She gave him access to things he didn't know he could interpret. Frequencies, language shards, environmental codes in Velari dialects. He used the interface to trigger a false heat signature behind a collapsed ruin wall. The pursuing drones diverted. Seconds won, lives extended. They ducked into a temple alcove etched with Eliari sigils, Vera already scanning for a way through. He fell against the inner column, breath-ragged shoulder scorched. She examined the burn and without hesitation tore a strip of her own armor lining to press against the wound. The cloth fused instantly, binding with human skin despite its alien origin. No words, no gestures. Only the press of her hand against his chest for one long anchoring heartbeat. Then they moved again, past the echoing halls of ruined worship and into the marrow of the structure where Eliari sentinels once stood. The machines were long dead, their sockets gutted, but the power beneath the floor still whispered. Jalen activated one of the ancient consoles and Vera moved beside him, her fingers sliding across the crystalline keys with a familiarity he couldn't explain. Together, they navigated to the internal chamber where a comm relay node still blinked with pale light. He interfaced the system, his mind spilling across the console like liquid code. Her thoughts surged with his flashes of her past embedding in the transmission. They sent a burst message across 4 frequencies encrypted in Eliari matrices, each carrying the coordinates of Cyrex's false border documents and military orders authorizing the ambush. The console blinked twice, confirmation sent. But the ground shook. Outside reinforcements had arrived, heavier armor, more troops. The entire basin began to quake under the pulse of drop engines. A high-pitched resonance filtered through the walls, an active scan ping tuned to override even Velari's shielding. Jalen staggered, nose bleeding, the signal fracturing his equilibrium. Vera stood firm, but her posture faltered. The sink between them wavered. He steadied her. The system fought back with everything it had, electric heat searing across his neck as the building's ancient failsafes began to collapse. Dust fell from the ceiling. Cracks crawled across the pylons. The core chamber buckled as external firepower began to breach the walls. Vera pulled him toward a hidden stairwell, remnants of a priestly access tunnel. They stumbled downward, hand in hand, surrounded by shaking stone and flickering sigils that cried out in broken language. A final pulse erupted as the relay tower above collapsed. They barely made it out before the ruin caved in behind them, breathless, bleeding, but alive. The two collapsed behind an outcropping on the far ridge overlooking the smoking remnants of the Velari Tower. From here, they could see the arrival of new Velari forces troops securing the site, unaware of the data that had already left. Vera's gaze lingered on the destruction, jaw clenched. Her entire life had once been wrapped in temples like that. Now they were ash. Jalen placed a hand on her shoulder. She didn't shrug it off. Instead, she reached for his hand and pressed it briefly to the edge of her jaw, where the Velari sigil had burned brightest during the bonding. His fingers traced the curve there, feeling a rhythm pulse beneath her skin that matched his own. They did not speak, but something between them no longer needed to. The wind blew hot across the ridge. The hunt was not over. Dawn crept across the fractured landscape like the slow reveal of a battlefield painting brushstrokes of gold over ash and shattered stone. Smoke rose in gentle spirals from the remains of the Velari ruins, mixing with the morning haze in a stillness that felt like an aftershock. Jalen and Vera stood at the edge of it, shadows long behind them, gazes fixed forward. There was no triumph in their eyes, only the knowledge that everything had changed, and not for the last time. They moved in silence through the lower ridges, following ancient dry riverbeds and the bones of collapsed settlements. The land bore the memory of old civilizations overgrown with crystalline flora and black moss. Their destination lay far beyond these ruins, a Velari command outpost nestled into the mountain spines of the northern plateaus. If they could reach it, they could present the data from the Velari relay Cyrex's false border authorizations, proof of internal conspiracy evidence that war with humanity had been engineered. But there was little time. Vera walked with increasing strain. The sink had drained her, and the wound from earlier pulsed anew beneath the stabilizer patch. She didn't complain, never paused, but Jalen felt it through the bond. Each step echoed with dull pain, and her breathing had begun to fray at the edges. By midday, she collapsed. They were deep in a narrow ravine surrounded by red shale and broken obsidian teeth. Jalen caught her before she struck the ground. Her skin burned under his touch. Her bio-tattoos had dimmed. The Velari resonance in their bond flickered, momentarily severed before stabilizing again in a weaker pulse. He lifted her, carried her across uneven terrain, feet slipping, shoulders buckling under her weight. Every instinct in his body told him to find shelter and wait. But time was the enemy now, and her life was measured in hours. He wrapped her in scavenged cloaks, secured the crystalline data core to his back, and continued. Night fell like a dropped curtain. The plateau rose before him, its jagged edge glowing faintly under Velari beacon lights. Towers grew from the cliffs like living mineral structures swaying slightly with internal energy. The command outpost shimmered behind an illusion field visible only to those who knew where to look. He walked into it without slowing. The guards found him within moments. Blades drawn, weapons primed, alarm nodes flared, and there he stood, bloodied, limping, draped in the garb of an exile, holding a dying Velari warrior in his arms. Chaos erupted. Voices shouted in overlapping dialects, commands, accusations, threat protocols. But before the killing blow fell, he spoke, not in human language, not even in the current Velari tongue. He spoke the phrase Vera had taught him during the night hours in the cave, an invocation of sanctuary reserved for the gravely wounded. The words cracked from his mouth like old stone, awkward and broken, but true. The guards froze. For a breathless second, tradition outweighed suspicion. They lowered their weapons. He was led to a triage chamber deep within the outpost. Machines hissed and scanners swarmed over Vera's form as Jalen stood behind the glass barrier, refusing to be moved. Surgeons and tech priests worked in tense harmony, calling out her vital collapses in short bursts of technical Velari. Her condition was unstable. Multiple systems had entered biorejection loops. Only Velari blood treatment could stabilize her, and even then only barely. He watched it all, watched as her form disappeared beneath layers of transluminescent gauze limbs bound in genetic stabilizers. Her breath reduced to shallow hums beneath oscillating light. She survived the night, but she would not be moved again without triggering relapse, and Cyrex had already been notified. They came for him at dawn, 6 warriors in ceremonial garb, followed by an elder whose presence bent the room with gravity. Thamor. His horns were silver with age, eyes ageless in their quiet brutality. He demanded answers, and Jalen gave them not with protest, but with evidence. He presented the crystalline relay core. Its holographic interface bloomed into light. They saw everything: false orders, fabricated border incursions, Cyrex's signature embedded in sequence, his authorization of the strike on the Equinox, the exile order placed on Vera under forged charges. The room fell into stunned silence, then anger. Thamor did not speak for several long breaths. When he did, it was with weight. The council would be convened. Cyrex would be summoned, and Jalen would be confined until judgment. They separated him from Vera. The cell was quiet walls curved from living stones softly pulsating with residual resonance. He couldn't feel her directly anymore. The pod's sync had faded, no longer actively maintained, but some faint echo of her presence remained like the warmth of breath on his skin. Hours passed, or days. He lost track, until the guards returned flanking Thamor once more. This time they did not carry chains. They led him into the central amphitheater, a council chamber carved into the side of the mountain open to the sky. Hundreds of Velari elders, warriors, and tech priests gathered. At the center stood Vera, upright barely, but her back was straight, her bearing undeniable. Royal. She had told him once, in the quiet moments between ruin and flight, that her bloodline traced back to the ancient matriarchs, that Cyrex had exiled her not out of punishment but out of fear that her claim to the leadership of the Velari clans might be accepted by those still loyal to tradition. Now she stood again, and beside her Cyrex entered. Draped in battle honors and polished arrogance, his sneer twisted with practiced disdain. He denounced the evidence as human fabrication. He called the crystalline relay an abomination, accused Vera of conspiring with an alien to undermine Velari sovereignty. Then Jalen stepped forward. The murmurs began. He activated the final piece of data embedded in the relay core, a recorded command sequence from Cyrex's own console, corroborated by Eliari timestamping and biometrics. Irrefutable. The silence that followed was total. But justice in ancient Velari law was not given freely. A foreigner could not stand as accuser and survive, unless he invoked the right, the trial of swords. Vera's eyes met his across the chamber. In them he saw the risk, the truth, the fire. He stepped forward and spoke the invocation. The crowd roared in disbelief. Cyrex laughed. But he accepted. The arena was older than most of the Velari settlements surrounding it. Carved into the living rock of the mountain spine, its floor bore the scars of 1,000 duels, pitted stone-broken sigils, half-buried fragments of blades left where they had fallen, unreclaimed by their wielders. No illusion technology cloaked this place. No advanced shields. Just airstone and blood. That was the point. Jalen stood at its center, stripped of his field gear, wrapped in ceremonial combat robes, too light to feel protective. The twin moons hung low, casting the pit in overlapping shadows. Across from him, Cyrex stood as a monument to certainty, taller, broader, his plated armor glinting with ritual etching, every motion deliberate. His horn rings were still intact, his gaze flat with disdain. He had no doubt he would win. The crowd watched in expectant silence, the amphitheater filled with Velari nobles, warriors, and elders seated in solemn ranks. Vera stood behind the eastern gate, flanked by council guards, her posture straight, though her limbs still trembled with post-recovery fatigue. She did not speak. Her eyes said everything. The signal tone rang. Combat began. Cyrex charged. Jalen barely sidestepped the first swing, an overhead arc that cracked stone where it landed. Momentum alone carried Cyrex through the motion, turning his bulk into something almost balletic. Jalen backed away, circling, keeping his breathing steady. His only weapon, a short-bladed polearm made from alloyed wood and a recycled Eliari shard. His mind spun through every fragment of training, every half-remembered simulation, none of which had prepared him for this. But something else had. The bond. Though the resonance had dulled, its echo still pulsed somewhere between spine and instinct. As Cyrex lunged again, blade low, Jalen didn't think he responded. A sidestep into a torque, shifting his weight to use the downward strike against his opponent. The polearm cracked against Cyrex's arm, plating enough to stagger him. Not enough to harm, Cyrex snarled. The next assault was faster. Brutal slashes, each one intended to kill, not test. Jalen ducked, twisted, parried, retreated. Each breath was a victory. Each second survived another humiliation for the warlord. That humiliation grew visible in his movements. Less precise, more vicious. The crowd shifted. Vera stepped forward. Her fingers twitched, every motion mirrored unconsciously by Jalen's stance. As Cyrex raised his blade high, Jalen didn't block. He pivoted, swinging the Velari polearm in a low arc that caught Cyrex's leg at the joint seam. A spray of luminous blood marked the first wound. Gasps followed. Cyrex bellowed. He launched into a spinning strike that caught Jalen in the ribs, lifting him off the ground and slamming him into the arena floor. Stones split. Pain exploded. Jalen rolled away barely in time to avoid the killing thrust. His vision blurred. Blood pooled in his mouth. Every instinct screamed for him to stay down. He rose, not because he had to, because she was watching. Because the bond they'd formed in that Velari chamber hadn't faded. It had changed, grown roots. When he moved again, he moved not just with his body, but with hers. He feinted left, ducked low and swept Cyrex's knee. Another opening, another strike. He aimed for the base of the horn, not to kill, but to disorient. The shard tip shattered against the bone, but the impact staggered Cyrex long enough for Jalen to plant both feet and drive his shoulder into the warlord's chest. Cyrex stumbled. For a moment, the impossible hovered, and Jalen pressed it. With a final surge, he activated the Velari shard's buried command sequence. The polearm flashed, blooming into its secondary form, light wrapped in crystal lattice, an ancient resonance weapon keyed only to shared minds. The last gift of the pod. He raised it. The crowd rose to its feet. Cyrex lunged blind with rage. But Jalen didn't deliver the fatal blow. He stepped aside. Let momentum carry Cyrex forward. Cyrex turned too late and found the point of the polearm pressed to his throat. Jalen held it there, held the silence, then lowered the weapon. The Elder Council erupted in sound gasps, protests, shouts. Cyrex, gasping and heaving, reached for a hidden blade. But Vera moved. She crossed the arena before the guards could react, her steps swift despite her injury. Her arm extended in one seamless arc, delivering a stunning blow to Cyrex's temple that sent him sprawling. He did not rise. The council guards surged forward, surrounding the fallen warlord. Vera turned to Jalen. Their eyes met, and the arena went still. Later in the halls of the High Chamber, Thamor addressed the assembly with a voice like the grinding of time. Cyrex was stripped of title held in stasis until trial. Vera, rightful heir of the Velari high bloodline, was reinstated as acting matriarch until the celestial rites could be formalized. The evidence provided by Jalen was ratified into record. Velari aggression against humanity had been unlawful, orchestrated from within. A war averted, a future rewritten. But even within, victory lines remained. Jalen stood at the edge of the ceremonial platform, wrapped in formal regalia he didn't understand, facing a species that didn't trust him. Not yet, maybe never. Vera joined him in private before his departure. Her horns were newly polished, her robes stitched with her house's reborn sigil. Her posture held centuries. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet thunder. He would return to Earth with an official post liaison between human command and Velari leadership. A bridge, a symbol. His presence alone could rewrite the narratives on both sides. But she would remain. For now, rules still held sway. The matriarch could not bind with an off-worlder, not under the current laws. Unless he returned. Not as liaison, but as something else. He stepped toward her, his fingers grazing the edge of her horn, the contact sending a familiar warmth through his chest. And she didn't pull away. The sun rose over Valaris. And so the tale ends, not with a kiss nor a farewell, but with a silence filled with promise. On a war-torn moon between empires, a human and a Velari warrior rewrote what their people believed was possible. Through instinct, sacrifice, and the ancient magic of resonance, they forged something stronger than treaties or weapons understanding. Jalen Mir returned to Earth not as a survivor, but as a symbol. A liaison between two civilizations that once knew only mistrust. He carried with him the data that exposed a conspiracy and the memory of a bond that defied law, expectation, and species. He had touched the soul of another world, and in return had left his own. Vera Thalor rose to her place not as a pawn or exile, but as matriarch. Her bloodline restored her voice unshakable. She ruled with memory, not vengeance. Her decisions bore the shape of the human who once risked everything to carry her through fire. The path ahead would not be easy, but it would be walked together. And if the stars held truth, then perhaps one day the child of harmony and chaos would rise, part human, part Velari, wholly new, and carry the resonance of their love beyond every known horizon. If this story moved you, consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a comment below, and sharing it with those who believe science fiction can still carry heart. This is HFY Cinema, where every tale reminds us that humanity isn't defined by species, but by choice. Until next time, keep watching the stars.